Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's going on tonight?
Hey, Chris. Getting a good week started, midweek through, and seems that we had a little bit of summer coming in. I keep coming back to the weather because it's also very tied into renewables. I've just figured that.
It is, and I think last week we were talking hydro, and with all the rain that we've been having, it's probably helping our hydro funds quite a bit because here in Switzerland we depend on that hydro. Although I think it's a little bit too much rain in Italy these days. They're maybe getting a little more than they bargained for.
Oh, for sure. And I just walked by to the office this morning where we have the big river down to the Rhine Fold. I've never seen so high water and so much currency in the water. So I guess that's something with the late snow that we got as well.
Well, we could talk about hydro again, but I don't think that's the goal for today. I think what we want to do is maybe do a little conversation with our guest about the scorecard. How folks are doing on this electrification and how's the transformation going? That's kind of what I envision happening tonight. What about you?
No, I agree. And I think it's quite interesting as well. You know, we usually on these shows, we bring in topic experts on specific areas or specific knowledges. And today, maybe we broaden. I look forward to broaden the conversation a little bit and to get some data insight in terms of what's really going on, especially then in renewables, but also in some of the regions. I have a few questions that I really want to figure out where you see similarities of the energy transition versus maybe the telecom and the IT transition that we went through a few years ago. So yeah, looking forward to it.
We have an ambitious agenda for tonight. Probably makes sense to bring our guest on rather than keep speculating. So
Good idea.
Invite Dave Jones to the program. Dave, welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Johan. Thanks for the invitation.
Take off from the fact that you just mentioned that you pull together a global source. That's what your objective is, to have kind of a comprehensive view. Was this not being done before Ember started doing this? Is this unique to you guys, or is your view unique?
I'd like to say both. It kind of starts with the data. It's just very frustrating that data isn't out there. The IEA are getting better every day with the data that they pull out. But even when they're doing analysis on the work that they're doing, they'll do it for some key countries, and you hear the story about Europe, you hear the story about the US and India and China, and then that's kind of where they get a bit bored with the data and some of the storylines, and quite often there's not that in-depth level of data analysis coming past the key big countries.
So looking at the report, I think one of the main thing that I saw from it was we hear a lot of almost the FOMO, the fear factor in a lot of these parts. What I liked about the report was it was quite positive. And had a little bit of a positive twist to it, kind of where we're going. But in general, where do you see this as a summary of where we're heading? Because I like the positive part of it, and especially from a regional point.
It's very hard, isn't it? Because it's just at the broadest level of just the kind of set out the bad news at the start. Yeah. 2022 hit a new record high for power sector emissions. So coal hit a new high, power sector emissions hit a new high. That's not where we're meant to be on the path to 1.5 degrees. We're meant to be in a world of falling emissions already, and we're not in a world of falling emissions already. So just at the highest level, it's a negative story. But when you look at the underlying momentum underneath that in terms of the investment, the technology, the policies that are coming through, it's hard not to be excited. And I think that when you look through and you kind of see how fast the electricity transition is happening across the world, it's really encouraging. And is it enough for 1.5 degrees? No, it's not there at the moment. Could it be? It could be if we really, really tried. We're a long way off course still. Um, but for us, it was really about tracking the kind of biggest part of the transition, which is around that rollout of wind and solar, which is happening so quickly across so many countries, and it now constitutes 12% of global generation. It was only 5% of global generation when the Paris Agreement was signed back in 2015. And the speed at which it's happening and stepping up year on year is increasing. So really interested to try and talk about that momentum that's happening. I think you were trying to maybe think about some other sectors in which such growth has happened, and just to give you like a little bit of an insight on the wind and solar side. Just that growth in global solar generation last year was enough to power the whole of South Africa. The growth in wind generation last year alone was enough to power the whole of the UK. So that's the level of kind of maturity of wind and solar have reached.
So why don't we hear this more? Because I think this is fascinating. You know, we tend to hear that obviously coal is increasing as well, oil as well, but what we hear is usually we don't want the wind on my backyard. Yeah, they're struggling with the grid, etc. There's always these ifs and buts and when, but it's wouldn't this help? Because momentum feeds momentum. And
Yeah, yeah, and I'm always a foot glass half full person, and I'll always try and put that positive spin on. I think that I think there is a really good story to tell on this. I don't want to sugarcoat things where things aren't there to be sugarcoated, but where there is a good story to be told, and there is good momentum, you want to embrace that, encourage that. You want to really you want to get people excited about that for all sorts of reasons. Just at the very like most basic level, I had an electric car delivered last week for the first time. I've had that my partner ordered, and super excited about that, and just being a part of that, seeing understanding a little bit that you can actually be driving around and powering it off clean power is that in itself is it kind of relates back to humanity in every level.
So I get the momentum, I get the excitement, I hear it in your voice and the passion. Who's funding this kind of activity? So, if you're a non-for-profit, where in your reports are available. So, I went online, I was able to download and get all the insights and information that your team, there's 40 people working on this. Where does the funding for this kind of activity come from?
There's a lot of kind of very rich foundations out there and across the world, and a lot of them want to put their money towards good causes, and a lot of them have given money towards climate change. There's something like 2% of the world's philanthropic money is given towards accelerating work on climate change. The main person that funds, or the main organisation that funds my work is randomly an IT company who made far too much money, wanted to give some of that money away to have an arm's length agreement on their foundation. We applied for some money from them. They wanted to put some money towards climate change associated with data, and they give us core funding, so they don't have any kind of say about what we do with that money. They just want to be in a position where we're using some of the data to be able to explain about getting that electricity transition moving faster. So, which is, from my perspective, very nice to see, and hopefully there's no too many conflicts that it creates along the way.
No, I'm just curious as where that came from. I wasn't trying to uncover anything. Just interesting where the funding comes for this. That the one thing with the global report that I would think would be challenging is transparency in the data you get, right? So, you include places like China and India and other parts of the world. How confident and how reliable are you on the kind of data you can get from other parts of the world, right? The EU, I think, would be relatively easier to do comparatively if you're located here. Maybe not. Maybe.
Yeah, and we've just released a report looking at the transparency of electricity data across every country in Asia, and it's really interesting just to go across and compare what that is. The gold standard that you're looking for is obviously you want hourly electricity generation by unit with all the bells and whistles on it, and obviously what you get is nothing close to that at all. So when you look across the world, within Europe, yes, you're right, data quality really good. For China and India, you get monthly electricity data without a lag on it. You get it at a provincial level as well. So it's not too bad what you get there. And then there are other countries like Indonesia, where only last week they actually released the annual view of what happened last year. There's no monthly breakdown in that. There's no kind of other commentary or other numbers within that at all. So, and there's still, and then the black spots for us are really across Africa and the Middle East, where data reporting is really, really terrible. And like we're in a constant kind of process of keep going through, checking data sources as they improve, and every day something improves somewhere because the data quality is getting better every day. But it's a key frustration for us, and certainly just at the most basic level, it's always a secondary ask to governments. Make your data available, please, so people can start looking and tracking this.
So where do you rely on the data? Is that through your analysts, or is there anything that is publicly that you can bring, especially from maybe countries that might not have an official part?
Yeah, it comes from a variety of sources. So, like if you're like it's come from system operators, it's coming from Ministry of Energy sources. I say sources, I mean kind of official publications out there. Depending on the country, it's published in different ways with different levels of aggregation and kind of skills that you need to be able to do that. But what's lacking is some way to put it all together where you can make comparisons by country meaningful, to be able to look at a transition and articulate it in any meaningful sense. And that's really where we want to come along, do that, make that data open, available for people to be able to use that in their own way. So it's not just us doing our own insights and our own data. It's making that available to people. We see so many people using it, which is really nice.
And earlier you were talking about the 2022 report, and you were saying, hey, coal use was up, and you were excited about the other activity to electrification and green electrification in particular. But isn't 2022 still an outlier year? COVID was kind of a surreal time, and the gas prices in Europe and things going on with Europe. Was that an outlier, or is it a fair year to judge the whole trend? Right. I mean, I know people went back to using gas and things like that. There were things that were counterintuitive to the goal.
2021 was an extreme year. So the bounce back from COVID, you saw a record increase in coal use. It was really almost kind of threw you back into that, from electricity side, threw you back into that trajectory that we had before COVID. That's not true, obviously, for oil, where oil demand is still lagging because of transport restrictions. But on electricity, that rebounded back in 2021. 2022, most places of the world was probably fairly representative. It wasn't within Europe. You started off talking about the river levels at the start, but Europe, as you well know, had a 1 in 500 year drought last year. So there was a massive deficit in hydro generation across Europe,
nuclear,
especially the Alps. Sorry?
And nuclear, right? I mean, EDF.
Yeah, exactly. And then secondly, exactly. And then between the EDF's terrible problems that they had, and then the German plant, the units that got taken off as part of their phase out, basically year on year, a seventh of total electricity production in the whole of Europe got wiped out just with those two factors alone. So it was no surprise that there was like a small rise in coal and gas generation. The rise in coal and gas generation only was a small part of that. Most of actually 3/4 of that change was either met through wind. That deficit was either met through wind and solar, or actually through falling electricity demand. As we went through a crisis, and obviously, as you know, electricity demand has fell throughout the whole of Europe's economy. So 2022 was very exceptional for the EU, and our analysis for Europe is really a bounce back with with a vengeance in 2023 on Europe's side. So already we can see through to the end of April, we can see fossil generation down across the EU by 16%, gas and power about the same, down about 16%, and we expect that the year-end numbers may be even bigger than that as the hydro levels come back again, as some of the French nuclear come back again, and most importantly, as that annual step up in wind and solar that always happens really kicks in.
Another part that I found extremely interesting in the report, and I mentioned that in the opening as well, where me and Chris, we both come with a telco background, and when we went from fixed telephony into mobile telephony, it was a big shift, and certain countries kind of leapfrogged. I think it's one of the words you also use in the report, from being in the telco industry, from being kind of zero technology into doing everything on your phone. And you're talking about this also in the report in some of the regions, some of the countries where you leapfrog also in the energy transition. How how can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? Because I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really see that as much within Europe because we're used to
For
kind of
sure.
clean electricity replacing the existing infrastructure. But if you take China as an example, China is going obviously building up huge amounts of clean power at the same time as they're building up selling huge amounts of electric cars. So there's a whole part to that transition that in some ways they're bypassing. And obviously, when you look at countries within Africa, that's even more extreme when they haven't kind of got any legacy, almost any legacy generation there are coming from a very low base. So it's kind of exciting what electrification and clean power combined can do, where you're almost building up from scratch a clean power economy. The way that I like to think about it is, that context within Europe is really about changing the whole of the existing fossil economy we've got to run on towards clean power. But for countries that don't have that already, you're building up a clean power economy from scratch, and it's a very different kind of way and mindset of doing that. And I guess that those countries are kind of still a little bit early stage of that, trying to work out exactly what that looks like for them, because although we kind of got this global transition going on, and there is kind of wind and solar everywhere, it really is Europe, the US, China, India that are kind of leading on that. And there's a report out just now on by the IEA on clean energy investment that really just highlights how far many of those emerging markets are falling behind on clean energy investment, which is very sad.
Which is which is obviously the other part of it, because I think it's fascinating coming back to the positive parts of that, the glass half full, where we see economies, and especially the rise of the middle class, and the use of energy in China and in parts of Africa, that this is actually then fueled by more and more renewables, and then kind of leapfrogging that, which is a positive part, because we always hear about the negative parts around this. But obviously, if the investments are not going there, then it's another problem.
Well, the investments again, they're having within Africa, they're having problems with any energy investment at the moment. So it's not like there's a huge influx into fossil when the fossil emissions are out of there. They're really struggling to get any energy investment, and obviously, as time stepping up, that clean energy investment is going to be is the kind of way they're going with that, and you can see it building up, but it does take time, and the problem, as you well know, with the electricity transit, with clean electricity, is there's so much capex upfront expenditure in that the cost of capital is just so extreme. Even before the recent rises in global interest rates, many emerging countries are really struggling with that cost of capital, and you can see that now is really becoming a big global conversation about how you can bring the cost of capital down for those emerging markets.
And then, have there been innovations? Like, I know, like, grid storage has been energy has been an important thing that people have been working on. How is that playing into that? Are we there? Are we starting to see grid scale storage that's impacting some of your reports and some of the markets and the prices of energy, or the ability to make it available green energy all the time?
it's got so much further to develop. So on the lithium, like at the moment, all the electricity storage side is either around kind of legacy kind of technology around pump storage. So obviously, there's conversations around how much further pump storage can take you and similar technologies to that, but they really depend on geology and getting that geology right. There's not many sites for them. A bit slow to implement. On the battery side, at the moment, it's almost all lithium-ion batteries. So stuff that has a very short cycle, which is very useful for diurnal solar, where you can charge it during the daytime, release it throughout the evening, and then the early morning. But for wind that maybe comes across and you have lulls in wind that last for a week or two during winter when you have high periods of demand, like you do in Northwest Europe, you need some longer storage devices out there, and that technology is still very much in its infancy. There's all sorts of competing technologies out there. I'd love to see how they develop. I don't know too much about them. If you're thinking about any follow-up questions,
I was just curious to see if you were seeing that impact your if you're seeing impact in your studies and your numbers, right? Because it's going to be part of the story at some point, right? In your availability and ability
It,
to store.
it is, and when we look within Europe, I guess we're at that stage now where you add like that amount of solar and wind that we're adding into the mix. You're at that point where still kind of gas and fossil fuels can provide a lot of that flexibility around there, and every year that go on, you're going to get a bit more desperation for that long-term energy storage in there, and we're certainly getting to the point towards the end of this decade where there'll be a real need for it. At the moment, we've managed to get by with some of the existing flexibility within the system, but we won't be able to do that forever.
And your report showed demand increasing, right, for electric, except for I think Europe was slightly down, but generally there was increase in demand. Um, how is that going with things like heat pump transformation and other, demand reduction? Like there's a lot of effort as well. So even though overall energy use may be increasing, I think the efficiency or using it more efficiently is one of the efforts. Are you seeing that impact across your studies?
Global electricity demand rose by 2.5% last year. About three-quarters of that rise was across China and India, and a little bit in the US, where the US bounced up last year. So at the moment, so much of that rise is coming from within Asia, and I guess the in developed countries in the US, in Europe, we're used to stagnant electricity demand. It's been fairly much unchanged for a decade in most countries, and that's going to change very quickly. We don't really see it happening big enough in the numbers at the moment. Weirdly, the only countries that you see with that kind of big rise up are countries with data centers, Denmark, Ireland. It's incredible how much electricity is going into data centers there. But that rise of heat pumps and electric vehicles will come. Electrolyzers being built like this, will be built like there's no tomorrow. I said tomorrow, they'll be built like there's no tomorrow. Um, and and they're going to quite quickly build up that electricity demand. So at the moment, where so much of that clean electricity that's being built is displacing coal generation and gas generation, in the future that's going to be displacing all the sectors outside the power sector, the transport sector, the building sector.
And who do you hope benefits from your reports? So you've got reports, you've got some good news, you got some bad news. It's kind of mixed results. Who should be reading these reports, and who are you hoping are influenced by the reports you're producing?
Just at the most basic level, you want people to have more confidence in clean power, and specifically around what we call the twin superpowers, are wind and solar. They'll be like when you look through like what needs to happen in this decade. I'm only talking about this decade. Like the toolbox we have available to us is pretty small for big emissions reductions. There's all sorts of kind of smaller tools out there, but the two biggest tools by a long way, according to the IPCC, according to other energy modelers, are wind and solar, because of the rate of deployment that they can hit within this decade. So for me, it's really trying to focus on those two technologies, try to reassure people how far the world's come already, and to be able to tell a good story around that and have a bit of confidence that the countries that do have it already, they're not alone. This is a global thing. We're all in the same bucket. And actually, when you look across regions, it's amazing how many regions are pretty similar. You've got the US, you've got especially the EU out in front, but you look at Asia as a whole. Asia as a whole is in line with the global number. Latin America is in line with that global 12% of wind and solar of electricity coming from wind and solar, and then it's only Africa and then the Middle East that are significantly lagging behind on that regionally. So that's our kind of thought process on all of this, and it's weird going towards a kind of another Middle Eastern COP of COP28 towards the end of the year, thinking about just all those sunny spaces everywhere and just how they're kind of going to waste at the moment within the Middle East, where
So more another environmental meeting in air-conditioned tents in the desert.
literally 100% of the electricity in most in Middle Eastern countries is still from fossil fuels. Not so much coal, which is great, so almost no coal, so almost all oil and gas. But they didn't have the legacy nuclear, they don't have legacy hydro generation, they haven't started building wind and solar yet, so they don't have any really clean electricity in the mix at all. And it's a little bit galling, and you kind of sit there hoping that that's going to change one day. You look at the promises of Saudi Arabia, and they've talked about this for a long time, put targets on for 2020. Now they have some really aggressive ones for 2030, but on the ground, only 2% of their electricity is coming from renewable sources or clean sources.
Interesting. Johan?
That's an interesting point as well, because if you look at, for example, COP28 is coming up in Dubai in December, and the lead of COP28 will be the chairman of one of the Qatari oil companies. And there was a lot of criticism around this, and I think in the Wall Street Journal recently, and some of the countries come out to say, how can we have a person that is head of one of the largest oil companies to head up the COP28. But also what was interesting to hear is the amount of investment they're doing in renewable energy. So is that investment then going elsewhere rather than in the region?
I wonder. I can't speak of specifics because I don't know the specifics off the top of my head. But
Sure.
I don't know how much of that is happening versus how much of it will happen. And also, like when we look at the moment about what's happening in those COP conversations, there's so much discussion around CCS and hydrogen. And they obviously have a role to play in all of this, and quite a lot of the time they're rolled into those clean investment numbers. So it may be that they're not talking specifically around renewables deployment as as I'm thinking about it from a clean power perspective. And we're kind of like trying to hypothesize at the moment through what some of those landing points for like agreements could come out of COP28, because nothing really happened last year, and I think that really they're desperate for a big agreement to come out this year, and I don't think it could be something as extreme as a fossil fuel phase out. But the that trying to focus on the accelerating the deployment of clean power, setting targets for the amount of clean power at a global level. I think that might be a landing point, and that's certainly what you hear many people talking around already, and certainly Adabra himself, the head of COP that you're talking about, he keeps talking about that need of tripling renewables deployment by the end of the decade.
All right, I think we're coming up on time. I thought I can go on forever with this. I love these discussions around more of a broader point of view. But I think it's quite interesting. We had the opportunity to read the report. Maybe just as a final thing for our audiences, where can they find the report if they want to read more about this?
Ember-climate.org. So our website has that, and it has all that data in there. So please, if you want to download any of that data, do your own analysis, please get stuck in.
Yeah, and we'll put that in the show notes as well, Dave, so our audience can link to the report and they can see it, because there's a lot of information in there, and you can absorb and get a good glance of what's happening. Like I said, that's why we were excited to bring on and hear what you're pulling together. I enjoy the passion. I hear a little bit of desperation or worry about the timing throughout the thread, that anything that isn't now may seem a little too far away from perspective from what I can hear in your voice. But I want to thank you so much for sharing with us on the episode today. It's been an interesting conversation.
I try not to let that desperation creep out too wildly.
Obviously, we talked a little bit around the report. This is an ongoing report. We discussed a little bit in terms of the coming out of the COVID years, but maybe as a kind of a summary, what are the main findings from 2022 that you think stood out across the report?
The main findings for me were that continued, obviously that continued step up in wind and solar, the fact that continued trend of fast accelerating electricity demand, especially across Asia, is really interesting. And for us, it was a bit alarming that that clean power sources outside of wind and solar fell for that first time since Fukushima, and looking forward, it's really interesting to see kind of the role of nuclear picking up as public opinion shifts somewhat on nuclear, because it had a pretty terrible year last year. 2023 will be a bit more different, not just within Europe, but also within some of the reactors coming back within Japan, and you can still see a lot of new build discussions happening across Asia at the moment, which is really interesting. So in total, it was in total for 2022, it was a positive picture from a wind and solar perspective, but from overall, where you still have rising coal generation, we still set ourselves that historic high for coal power and coal emissions, where like we said before, emissions need to be falling.
I think though, but what I took out of the study is that overall energy demand went up, but the percentage of renewables you were happy, the amount of energy produced from renewables also went up. So although there were new emissions and more emissions going out, it was percentage wise more renewable, right? Than what it had been
Yeah,
before,
yeah,
right?
and that number's kind of slowly creeping up every year, which is very reassuring. So when you look across like the changes in energy mix, sorry, electricity mix, if you go back to 2015 when Paris came around, and you go through all the major economies of the world, and as you've seen a pick up in clean power, you've seen that offset in fossil generation. So you've now got China's coal share in the mix, several percent lower than when it was in 2015. It's coming down within India and other countries as well. But as electricity demand's coming up, we're just using more of the stuff. So that's this weird dichotomy that we face at the moment, where we're building this clean power. The share of clean is going up, but actually fossil generation has been edging up as well. It's been edging up more and more slowly every year, but it's still hit that new record in 2022.
Now, are you worried that, I mean, we're not in a particularly robust economy globally at the moment. So demand is going to be a function of GDP, and demand is going to be what else is going on. So do you think we're seeing the real numbers? I mean, they're obviously they are what they are, but do you expect that to change if the economy were to get much stronger?
Yeah, the global economy is going to be one of the key factors that certainly goes into what's happening in 2023, and where we are for 2023, and looking there, we think that that clean power growth is going to more than meet the electricity demand growth, but that's based on the electricity demand growth we've had on average for the last 10 years, about 2.5%. It was 2.5% last year. As well, we know it's going to step up more in the future as electrification comes out. But there are some big questions within this year about how big that energy, or especially electricity demand growth, is going to be. And at the moment, it's trying to track numbers, especially on China, about how much economic growth picks up there, and that's really going to be a function of how much stimulus they pour in. And it's a bit hard to tell where that's going to swing at the moment within 2023.
And then you also mentioned in the report, and you mentioned it just a moment ago in the conversation, that the renewables that we have today, or the low carbon, so nuclear, if you view it as renewable or just a low carbon option, hydro. We just did an episode on hydro where we were talking to a Swiss hydro company, and they had a relatively new hydro operation that we were talking about that had been online about 9 months. but there seemed to be that was flat or actually declining. So how does that change, or why is that going to change when so much of the focus and money in the flash is, you know, wind and solar? That's what people are talking about, and those are the projects we hear a lot about. So how
I
does
think
the other one's going to become a reality?
yeah, I think that what's going to become clear to everyone is that we need all of the above. So, like, I spend a lot of time talking about wind and solar because I think they're the biggest tools in the toolbox. But you need like every one of these technologies coming through to be playing their role. And still, the two biggest sources of clean electricity globally are not wind or solar. They are what you just mentioned. They're hydro and then nuclear power. And we're in that. From a hydropower perspective, um, I can't remember exactly what that conversation was on the Swiss side, but generally speaking, across Europe and across North America, there aren't that many more sites to develop. They come with big environmental consequences in themselves. They have big long lead times. But there are reasons to want to keep developing hydro. There's an expectation that hydro projects will pick up. There's just a kind of limited amount of sites across the world for that, and I do hope that investment kind of carries on. The what we saw within China last year was the last of the massive large hydro dams come online that they've been building over the last decades. So China and India are the kind of two bigger countries building out hydro at the moment, but both countries not as big as they have been in themselves.
So if we look at the other part of it, then we said solar and wind was interesting, of course, and we talked a lot about that. We had the hydro with its limitations. What about nuclear? You know, we had Germany with their political decision. It's only a few weeks ago now when it was shut down. I know France is starting to look at are we building out because we need those balancing uh, sources to support the wind and solar. How do you see that across the regions regarding nuclear?
Yeah, so it really just we're seeing a bit of a renaissance within Asia at the moment on nuclear, which is quite exciting in its own way. For the first time ever, there's now public support in favour, or the net public support is in favour within Japan of bringing back the nuclear power plants that went offline after Fukushima. So that's a big turnaround in public opinion that you see mirrored across many countries. So Japan are now not just returning their old power plants, but building new power plants. Korea are involved in that. China are the biggest manufacturer, sorry, the biggest have the biggest number of nuclear power plants coming online, and they themselves are trying to work out exactly how big do they want to make that. So at the moment, they're not by Chinese standards, they're not going big on nuclear. It's part of the mix that they're pursuing alongside wind and solar, hydro, and bioenergy to build clean power. It'd be interesting to see whether the kind of nuclear lobby gets more power within China to extend that growth further. And I think like part of that really also depends on how that technology develops as well. So how much faith is there that the projects will be built to time and to budget? Because that's been the main constraint before and the main concern for politicians, where they're in a big hurry to build clean power. They don't want to be wasting years and years and years on planning for nuclear power plants that may or may not happen.
And you mentioned in that answer, bio is one of the strategies, right? And so I guess that brings a couple questions to my mind, because I mean, if it's done well from the folks we've had on the podcast before, it's kind of net zero, right? It doesn't increase and it doesn't decrease from the bio. So are we at a comfortable point with the current goals of 1.5 degrees? If we were to stay at this point, would we hit the goal? So if we had a lot of bio, does that really help the mix? I mean, it's not really adding, so I guess it's not doing worse, but are we not reducing?
Yeah. No. You need more bioenergy. Bioenergy is one of those key points for energy growth. So the question is how much, and making sure that it's done in the right way. So just on how much, I think that probably five years ago, slightly more than 5 years ago, when you first had all these projections about how do you from integrated assessment models about how you keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees, there were huge amounts of bioenergy coming through some of those model results, because that was seen as the kind of cheapest, easiest way at the time. And now with the rollout of other kind of clean power technologies, there's kind of alternatives to that. So within the context of the IEA say that, oh yes, you don't need to increase bioenergy to reach 1.5 degrees, and they propose another scenario for that, and that involves a lot more really pushing the limits of clean power deployment for those other technologies much more. So so it is it's always going to be a tool. It's just making sure that it happens in the right way. And so many of those projects at the moment that either built already or in planning don't pass the smell test of how much they're actually reducing emissions, because fundamentally there's still CO2 coming out of the stack, and you need to be ultra sure that you have that offset and additionality of actually creating the bioenergy in the first place.
Yeah, I see that living in Europe where biomass for heating was something that folks thought was a great idea. And then you go cut down a bunch of forests somewhere else and ship the wood over to pellets over to Europe and they burn it. I don't see
Yeah, yeah.
like
My build up over the last several years has been doing a lot of work on the transport on the co-firing of wood pellets within coal power plants, and to me, like that's of all the ways to use bioenergy, that's just got alarm bells written all over it. And fortunately, within Europe, the conversations moved on from that now, where there are pellets being done. They're doing exclusively in bioenergy units that don't burn coal anymore, so there's not that kind of implicit subsidy in the continuation of coal that there was before. But there is still a problem with of the additionality of the CO2 that is sunk into those wood pellets in the first place.
so, and then kind of the last area that I think that we haven't really covered from my perspective that was in the report is carbon capture. There's a lot of infrastructure that's out there. If I put a turbine in today, it's going to have years of life ahead of it. And there is a pragmatic approach that fossil fuels can't just be switched off tomorrow. So I was relatively surprised at how little carbon capture played in your overall global report of what was going on. Is maybe you want to speak
So
to that?
yeah, so on our report, we're doing the kind of backwards tracking of where we are so far, and then we compare it to the forwards tracking of the IEA. So the forward numbers aren't our numbers; they're the IEA's numbers. And the IEA, like I said on bioenergy, where they've downscaled some of the expectations. The same's happened for carbon capture. There was some very crazy numbers out there for how people think that carbon capture are going to kind of save the world, and most of the modeling has got a lot more real to that now, but there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about what that's going to happen with that as a technology. So within the IEA numbers, most of the carbon capture that they forecast will happen outside of the power sector. So only 2% of the electricity by 2050 will have carbon capture in, whether it's on coal plants or bioenergy or gas plants. Um, and the But still with a large amount a fair amount of carbon capture outside all of that. And what's really interesting in the debate at the moment is how much that might step up. And what we've seen is within the UK, there's a number of projects that are being developed at the moment, especially around gas power plants, to attach some carbon capture to them. And then in the last month, or the last couple of months, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the UK, and then I don't know if you saw the emissions performance standard that's being proposed on power plants for 2035 in the US. There's now a huge amount of interest coming into carbon capture in the US as well. So it'll be really interesting to see how that technology plays out and what a role it can play. I guess some of the concerns that we've had before is there's been overspec, so it takes away the focus from other technologies. And the other concern is that it doesn't always take out all of the it doesn't take out all of the CO2 from that process, and when it is doing that, it's using a lot of energy in that process. So there's quite a lot of kind of technology development as well to making sure that you get to very high levels of carbon capture, and not using a huge amount of energy in the process of doing so.
So is that something you've seen? You mentioned it quickly. I thought that was quite interesting because we're talking about obviously the development of renewable energies towards the 1.5, but also the carbon capture. And I think you alluded to it here, but maybe explore a little bit on it. Where do you see that almost as a, I wouldn't say competitor, but almost in terms of the message where people have said, okay, you know what, we can build more carbon capture, and we don't have to focus so much on the renewable. Do you see that discussion's been there, or?
That's where the discussion was a few years ago, for sure, and I think we've moved on from that now, where hopefully where carbon capture is in that more realistic stage, and they can actually articulate a bit more realistically. This is what we can actually
Yeah.
achieve, as opposed to some really like outlandish numbers and all of that. But like none of this is written in stone yet, and you're like, and when you look at the pathways are changing all the time depending on how technology has come out of that. But the fundamental problem that we have is that we're like, even if when you add up all the promises of all the governments, we're still on target for over 2 degrees. We need to be around about 2 degrees. We need to be at 1.5 degrees or even lower if we can be. So all of this matters. So like I would never pitch this as a competition between the technologies. Because we need to be going as hard as we can on everything, including CCS.
But you still
Yeah.
have one thing that's common, right? It is a competition for dollars. So I think for many folks that we've talked to on the podcast, it's you're competing for limited finite resource. And if you push one technology over the other, that I think you mentioned earlier in one of your answers, bang for the buck, or the biggest return for what you would do. What many professionals would tell me is wind and solar got a lot of attention because it's a near term quick bang for the buck, right? And so whereas modular nuclear or some other things that are coming down the pipe, or fusion and things that will be great in the future, they don't want the distraction right now to hit the climate change goals of temperature, because it is competing. It really is a competition. There's only so much money in the system, right? Do you agree with that?
That's an interesting it's an interesting conversation itself, because uh, uh, um, I was just trying to work out how the heck you answer that question. There are like when you look at financing like clean power projects, so like if you're looking at a solar project, there's just so much money around for the moment for things like that, and like you say, for like other areas are struggling and all of that, but that's not necessarily competing for the same finance in the same way from the same bucket. That's not how I would characterize that. If you're an investor going into wanting to develop fusion or a modular fission reactor, then you're going to be looking at a totally different set of investors that are going to be investing that from one that's wanting solid supply, like predictable returns on a solar power plant, where you're trying to finance that on debt financing over 3 decades or whatever it is. So so
So you
I
you
see
don't
that I
agree.
see
That's
that
fine. We
how
can disagree.
sorry.
It's clearly you don't agree with my premise then, that they're competing for resources, right? That's what you're saying, is it's different funds, is what I'm hearing you say.
I think so
They're
for
not
different
fighting for
techno.
each
I think so for different technologies, certainly for CCS and those and more developing technologies that have a different risk profile attached to them. I do feel like they're almost separate buckets, but um, uh, I guess there's such a challenge on the clean power. Like there is a kind of more meta problem, which is how do you make sure that money is flowing in, and when like from because obviously I work on more on the NGO and campaigning side. It's really interesting to see what some of the finance people are looking at with problems out there, and really the biggest problem is financing into countries out into emerging markets and into lesser developed countries are really struggling with that finance. So what they're saying is that there is a problem. That the problem is not with financing in developed countries like Europe and the US. It's really in Africa, which still only attracts 1% of clean energy investment, which is just an insanely embarrassing number in this day and age.
And it sounds like throughout our conversation today on this podcast that Middle East and Africa have been the hardest place to get data. That those are the places that you still have a bit of concern of where things are going from what we've said on the conversation. I think I'm good with questions. I think this has been a fun conversation. I think we've got the conclusion on the other audio, so we don't need to do this as a conclusion because we already did that yesterday. Is there anything else that you want to add before we go? Before we wrap it up, because I don't have more questions to ask you, and we've got another. 15
No, that gave a lot more opportunity to bring in other bits. So thank you for that opportunity, and I think that will make it a lot richer.
And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this show. Do check out and download the report. I think you'll enjoy it. It's an interesting read. At least gives you a different perspective than you might have. And we hope to talk to you again next week. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe. Find us on YouTube. Find us on Facebook. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.